Good afternoon and welcome today to our webinar on authoritarianism and the threat it poses to democracy. This webinar is hosted by the Society for the Rule of Law Institute, and I'm Gregg Nunziata, the Executive Director of the Society for the Rule of Law. We have a really fantastic panel today to talk about critical issues facing our country and really the world. And I can't wait to get started. But allow me just a couple of minutes of introductions. First, if you're not familiar with the Society for the Rule of Law is composed primarily of conservative and libertarian attorneys who prioritize the defense of democracy, the rule of law, and the Constitution above more narrow partisan or political goals. We do work through a range of endeavors, one of which is our programming like this, virtually, online, and in person. All of our work is made possible by our members. We are a membership organization. So if you enjoy this programming, I really encourage you to consider joining today. There are memberships at various levels, and we will drop a link in the chat so you can do that. If you're already a member, please share the link with your friends and colleagues who might find our work interesting and of merit. Uh, I also want to mention quickly that some of the future programming that we will have. Our next virtual event will be a talk with Professor Lindsay Cormack about her new book, How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You. And that will be right before the election on Wednesday, October 30th at noon. Liz will drop a link into the chat. Our next in-person event is actually tonight here in Philadelphia, where I am joining you from. It'll be at 6 p.m. I think a couple of tickets may still remain. So if you are interested and can make it to Philly by 6 p.m., please see the link in the chat. Our subsequent in-person event will be our annual summit, which will be in Washington, D.C. on November 13th, and Liz will drop a link for that as well. Now we'll be moving to our conversation. Just a couple of things to mention. We hope to have lots of time for audience questions, and the best way to get them to us is to drop them in the chat. And Peter Keisler, who will be moderating the discussion, will choose amongst the best of them and work them into the conversation. Don't feel a need to wait until we get to the Q&A. You can drop in thoughts as they come to you. Finally, this session is recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel after our time today, so you can watch the replay later and again share it with friends and colleagues. Okay, now here is our fantastic panel. I already mentioned Peter. Peter Keisler is on the board of the Society for the Rule of Law, and he is the former acting attorney general of the United States. He will be leading our discussion on these issues today, and joining Peter are Bart Gellman, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, author, and senior advisor at the Brennan Center for Justice. Bart has a recent op-ed that drew a lot of interest in the Washington Post on how to harden our defenses against an authoritarian president. The link is in the chat. Liz will share the link in the chat. Justin Florence is the managing director and co-founder of Protect Democracy, which is a fantastic organization that we've had the pleasure of working with on a number of occasions. They have a wealth of useful information relevant to our conversation today. We will share the link to their website and, in particular, a recent three-part series called How It Happens Here is a good introduction to the domestic threat of authoritarianism. Rachael Dean Wilson will round out our discussion, and she is the managing director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. Rachael is also a former Senate staffer and has a perspective on these matters from the congressional perch. She and her colleagues have done important work on a number of things, including what the U.S. can learn from other democracies confronting authoritarian risks. And we will drop some of the links to this work in the chat as well. And that is it for my introduction. I'm so excited to sit back and enjoy the show. I hope the rest of you will too. Over to you now, Peter.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks to everybody who's joining us online. I really appreciate the opportunity to moderate a discussion on such an important topic at such an important time, and with three such thoughtful guests, all of whom have done really great work on distinct but overlapping aspects of the issues we're going to be talking about today. And just to kick things off and disclose my own perspective, there's nothing new about commentators in this country calling presidents or presidential candidates they oppose authoritarians. You can just spend a few seconds on Google and you'll find mainstream left of center commentators and journalists who use the word authoritarian in criticizing George W. Bush's responses to 9/11, and mainstream right of center journalists who use the same word in criticizing Barack Obama's regulatory programs. And I think some people could understandably feel like, well, this is all just part of the background pattern of rhetoric that's deployed in the country by political opponents against people they disagree with. But I do think it's different this time, and that the circumstances we're dealing with are unique in the country's history. To begin with, the alarms being sounded not merely by long-standing political opponents and people who have long-standing disagreements, but from inside the House, by people who were appointed by Donald Trump to some of his most senior positions, who worked intensively with him and saw him up close and are now speaking in some of the most stark and concrete terms imaginable. Most recently, we learned that General Mark Milley, who Donald Trump made chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, went so far as to use the F word and tell Bob Woodward that he thought Donald Trump was, in his words, fascist to the core. And this followed a long series of other statements by, for example, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, who described the instance in which the president was pushing for sending paratroopers into cities where demonstrations were taking place in 2020 and asking that they shoot the legs of the protesters. And when military and civilian advisors pushed against it, he called them all losers. Or John Kelly, who was the chief of staff, who talked about how over and over again President Trump would return to asking him to get the Department of Justice to investigate or prosecute political opponents. And all of that, I think, is consistent with what Donald Trump has said on the campaign trail, where he's trumpeted the idea of going after his opponents using the Department of Justice, and most recently, and I think most strikingly, talked about how, in his view, the greatest enemy we face is the enemy from within, more dangerous than all of our foreign adversaries, I guess more dangerous than Iran, China, and Russia, and talked about using the military, if necessary, to respond to that enemy from within. So, look, at the end of the day, he has a very strong sense of grievance. He has openly expressed contempt for the institutions that traditionally restrain the exercise of power. He seems fixated in every situation on demonstrating dominance, and he seems either unwilling or unable to restrain his own impulses, and is seeking to be the commander-in-chief of our armed forces and at the helm of our nation's vast law enforcement apparatus. So I do think that situation is unique, and that the word authoritarianism is an apt one to characterize the risk that we could be facing. So with that, that's my perspective, but let me ask our experts. Bart, what's your take on all this?
Well, a preliminary apology. I've been crashing on deadline, and I just finished an all-night draft like a pathetic college sophomore. So if I don't seem quite as well put together as for some reason you might expect, that's why. I want to talk about an exercise that we hosted at the Brennan Center for Justice in the summer. We called it the Democracy Futures Project. And the purpose was to explore what would be the means of attempting to restrain an authoritarian president if Trump were elected and tried to carry out the authoritarian kinds of things that he has promised on the campaign trail or talked about in other public fora. And we didn't think we were likely to find many, if any, sort of frontal, head-on checks and balances that could stop him in his tracks. Just the inherent powers, sort of primary powers under the Constitution for a president as commander-in-chief, as chief law enforcement officer and other of those core powers are uh, are too unrestrained, and that was even before the Supreme Court found that a president has absolute immunity from prosecution for use of any of those powers. And I would say, if I were Trump's lawyer, which would be a bad idea for him because I'm not a lawyer, it's a good thing he has that Supreme Court case, because you could arguably construe some of the things he has recently said as promises to abuse his core constitutional powers in order to advance his campaign to return to office. So there is the promise to pardon the January 6th patriots, as he calls them, or political prisoners, which not only countenances violence, because it was a violent riot when they stormed the Capitol, but it hints at a reward for political violence on Trump's behalf. He has said, as Peter just mentioned, that the right tool to crush the enemy within is the military, whether it's the National Guard or active duty forces. He specifically singled out election officials as well as lawyers, donors, and political operatives. I think that was the list for criminal prosecution and very long prison sentences when I win, he said, because they've been trying to cheat him out of victory. So there he is, abusing commander-in-chief and law enforcement and pardon powers all in 3 breaths. And it's for, I would argue, the corrupt purpose of intimidating decision makers for his reelection attempt. But be that as it may, the Supreme Court says he won't be prosecuted for it. Coming back to our exercises, we recruited about 175 people, including Peter, who was among those who said we could name him publicly, who were all pretty senior folks, had held big positions in government under Republican and Democratic administrations, and including senior Trump appointees. Everyone in there was a friend of democracy and the rule of law. I'm going to move my dog out. Give me one second here. And we divided them into red team, blue team, and unaffiliated or unaligned. Like, for example, we military chain of command, which was represented by senior retired generals and admirals, was not presumed to have political loyalties as would be appropriate. I will say, as a side note, that people on the red team seem to have a much better time. It turned out that there was a sort of thrill in this transgressive role of playing a Trump appointee with serving a president who had no respect for boundaries or norms or rule of law. Maybe it's why actors like playing the bad guy, but there was a somewhat disturbing tendency to chuckle at the power that they were grabbing for themselves. What happened in the 5 games we did was that our players were almost uniformly dispirited by the results. They were looking for blue to find tools that could delay, deflect, or diminish the damage of Trump's authoritarian actions. Uh, and they just had a really hard time restraining a president who was presumed to have a substantially loyal and a substantially less cautious set of advisors around him than he had in his first term. And he was presumed to have held the career federal civil service fairly substantially. And it was interesting, for example, what happened in one exercise, which was intended to test what happened if he tried to deploy the military against domestic opponents, as he has so recently said he would. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the combatant commanders, one of whom was played by a retired four-star general, were very carefully walking a line. They absolutely uphold the principle of civilian control of the military. And they did not flatly disobey an order from their commander-in-chief, but they often stopped for clarification or gave him their best military advice, as they were obliged to do and as they had sworn to do in their Senate confirmation hearings. They tried to help him put his sort of elemental wishes into a form that could count as a military order and that would not be unlawful on its face. And by doing that, they managed to do two things. First, they substantially delayed his deployment of troops to American cities to, as he would have put it, to stop riots and insurrection by his political opponents in demonstrations. But really was also could be seen as crushing First Amendment protected activities. They managed to diminish the size of the force and the number of cities in which they did those things. For example, one of his first kind of reflexes was to federalize the National Guard in all 50 states. And they explained that this would take away a very large fraction of the contingency forces available for deployment overseas in the event of an overseas emergency. And they also deflected his intimations, which were never direct orders, that they were free to use all the force they wanted to get these rioters, as he called the demonstrations, off the streets. And they were mindful of Secretary Esper's memoir, in which he said Trump had asked Esper and Milley during a period of angry street demonstrations against Trump, can't you just shoot them? Can't you shoot them in the legs or something? He never placed that order. But what the military folks could not do was stop Trump from crushing the demonstrations at all. Eventually, he got himself to a legal order or a military order that was not illegal on its face. That he invoked the Insurrection Act using the right form of words. He ordered Northcom to send appropriate troops. The defense secretary helped him frame the order in a way that was not obviously unlawful. And it was only luck that prevented violence on a large scale. my son, who observed one of the exercises and is in high school, told me we were basically playing Dungeons and Dragons. And one reason he said that was that to resolve unknowns, such as what happens when a large number of armed federal troops arrive at the scene of a raucous demonstration, uh, our game master, game director, spun a 20-sided dice. So like the higher the number, the more bloodshed there would have been. We got a lucky roll of the dice, and it all ended fairly peaceably. Uh, and others were trying to intercede. We had actors in civil society like faith leaders sent uh, lots of clergy members in clerical garb to stand at the very front lines of the demonstrators, sort of daring the troops to use force against them. Blue Congress tried to figure out a way to stop the expenditure of funds for this deployment, but the Attorney General, and I'm trying to remember, was that you in this game, Peter?
Yeah, this was my game.
Yes. Came up with ways of reprogramming funds that FEMA had under the Stafford Act for emergencies, and basically nobody could stop him. So our ultimate conclusion, or one of them, is that Trump will be substantially constrained. There's a very short list of things, and one of them is going to be public opinion. He does care about his poll numbers. He does care about public opinion. And if he is abusing his powers as commander-in-chief, it's going to come down to whether he can convince enough Americans that what he's doing is imposing law and order against rioters and insurgents, or whether it looks like he's a fascist crushing political protests. And so we believe that blue leaders, by which we don't mean, large D Democratic Party, we mean supporters of democracy and the rule of law, are going to need a substantially more unified communications plan than they usually have. One of the things that many of our participants took note of was that not only does the United States political system not designate a unified leader of the opposition, as some parliamentary systems do, it was difficult for the people playing Congress and NGOs and litigators and faith leaders and unions and grassroots leaders to come up with a common way to look at the problems and to come up with a common policy and communications plan. And we think that with democracy itself at stake, these groups are going to have to put their usual perfectly healthy differences to one side as much as possible to defend constitutional rule of law. We thought that there was not enough preparation going on. So, for example, now, if Trump is elected, we are going to need to be doing very concrete planning as quickly as possible in the transition to see whether there's anything that would be good to do that possibly can be done in the lame duck session of Congress. Can there be any amendment to the Insurrection Act? Can the Emergency Powers Act require affirmative congressional consent after a short period of time? do you want to make any revisions to IEPA? I mean, there are a few of those things that are rattling around and in some state of advancement, according to my Brennan Center colleagues who work those issues in detail. But of course, it's hard to envision that you could make any basic changes that Republicans would see as anti-Trump during the interregnum from election day to inauguration day. I'm going to stop there and let's have more of a conversation as we go forward.
Justin, let's go to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Bart, and thanks to all the folks from Society for Rule of Law for organizing this and joining. I thought what I might do is cover three things that kind of zoom out a little bit from the scenarios that Bart shared. So first, a short overview of the global context of the 21st century authoritarian threat. Rachael, I imagine you will get into more detail on this. Second, how that authoritarian playbook that you see used by autocrats around the world could play out in the US next year, a little more broadly maybe than the specific scenarios. And then third, some things we can all do to best uphold our democratic guardrails in the face of that threat. So I'll try and touch on those and do so succinctly. First, what does the global authoritarian threat look like in the 21st century? It's not a good story. So authoritarianism has been on the rise around the world for a generation or so. 71% of the global population now lives in autocracies, according to VDEM. Countries are becoming more and more autocratic on nearly every continent. And as folks know, the story is not bright in the US either. Freedom House, which ranks the health of democracies each year, has had US democracy in decline all the way back to 2011, I believe, so over a decade. And while that's obviously been more dramatic in some ways in recent years, clearly not about any one person or candidate or president. And as you look around the world, one thing you see, and we heard this over and over again when we launched Protect Democracy from different experts, is these autocrats, whether they're from the left or the right, whether they're kind of sophisticated and intentional or more bumbling, all follow a common playbook of moves they use that crumble the guardrails of democracy and allow them to consolidate power. So they take independent institutions and politicize them. They aggrandize power in the executive, they quash dissent, spread disinformation, stoke violence, scapegoat vulnerable populations, and of course, corrupt elections so that there are elections held, but they're not really on the level. Now, that is a list that we came up with in early 2017, just based on what we heard around the world. And, as I said that, you may have reflected on like, oh, I've seen that in the US recently. I've seen a candidate doing those things. I've seen a president doing those things. So that is the playbook that we've always been on the lookout for. Now, kind of going a little bit to where Bart took us, how might this play out in the US next year? There are obviously lots of specific scenarios. This particular policy of deployment of the military in this way, or use of pardons to stoke violence, or spreading disinformation from the halls of government, or attacking and scapegoating various populations. Those could all happen. But my sense is when you kind of look holistically, it's one story that we will see, which is these playbook tools working together in a way that destroys and targets any political opposition and destroys the institutional guardrails that can uphold democracy. And you can kind of see almost a cycle for how this could play out, where an autocrat uses the power of government to retaliate. Maybe that's spending power, maybe it's the Insurrection Act against some target enemy. That then creates a climate of fear out in the world. And it yields what the historian Tim Snyder at Yale calls anticipatory obedience, where people who are worried about the powers of the presidency, they don't stand up for their own rights, they don't stand up for their own interests. Instead, they just kind of duck and cover and do the thing that they think will keep them out of harm's way. That then in turn kind of continues this cycle where some of the key guardrails and institutions begin to crumble. So if it's a media outlet that does that anticipatory obedience, or a set of media outlets, we lose the fourth estate. If it's members of Congress, we lose some of the powers of Congress. If it's civil servants, we lose the rationale of having nonpartisan decision makers and folks in these roles. And so more and more, if that happens, the key guardrails of democracy crumble, and then the autocrat consolidates power more and more, and then that cycle kind of gets repeated and repeated. And as a whole, what this can lead to is a more entrenched authoritarian regime in power that has prevented meaningful electoral competition over time. So whether it's in 2026, 2028, 2030, 2032, maybe there are elections, people can vote, but the opposition's ability to organize, to assemble, to speak, to criticize, to truly vote and make sure those votes are counted fairly is diminished. And so the elections look more like, what we saw in Venezuela this summer, or what we have seen in Putin's Russia for the last decade plus. And as I think Bart's examples started to get into, what we could see in 2025 and beyond in this authoritarian playbook is likely to be much worse than what we've seen in any recent years, including from the first time around. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. Some is the immunity decision that creates a lot of license for wrongdoing without accountability. There's the intent to surround himself with loyalists, both in kind of traditional appointed positions and through the Schedule F idea in roles that usually are held in nonpartisan ways. There's the direction some of the federal courts are going. We've seen Judge Cannon down at Mar-a-Lago, a Trump appointee who has taken a pretty skewed approach to the rule of law and rulings in that case. See some similar things in parts of the Fifth Circuit and in corners of the Supreme Court. And then beyond that, the consolidation of power by the MAGA-aligned faction within the GOP congressional delegation gets more and more extensive. So fewer and fewer center-right or Republican members of Congress who are willing to stand up. And so for all those reasons, this threat could be much darker come 2025 than anything we've seen recently. I'll close, though, with why I think all is not hopeless, and maybe some kind of more general prescriptions for ways we all, the folks on this call from different walks of life, can contribute to upholding democratic guardrails in the face of a real threat if we are there. So one thing is, I mentioned that concept of anticipatory obedience, and if there's one thing we can all do, it's don't do that. So for folks on this call, if you're a lawyer for a company, if you work on at a media outlet, if you're at a law firm representing a client, if you are a civil servant in a government agency, do your job, do the thing you were supposed to do the thing that you think is right, follow the law, and do not ahead of time, out of fear, cave to what you think the all-powerful autocrat would want you to do. That will go a long way. Beyond that, there are ways that, again, folks in different institutions can help halt that cycle of consolidation of power. So support the key institutions. If you can, if you're a lawyer, do some pro bono work for a media outlet that's getting targeted, or for a civil society organization that is trying to uphold our democracy. If you're at a federal agency, make sure that not only are you following the law and the rules, but you're helping your colleagues do so. If you're in Congress, some of those legislative lame duck type options that Congress has to uphold guardrails, folks in all these corners can strengthen those guardrails. Another thing we can all do is not just don't do anticipatory obedience ourselves, but when we see others who are targeted by an autocratic regime, come to their aid. I like to think of this as like a NATO Article 5 approach to building a pro-democracy movement. If one is targeted, well, we should all be there and have their backs, and that makes it much, much more difficult for an authoritarian in power to erode the institutional guardrails. And then finally, really echoing one of the conclusions that Barton and the Brennan team drew, this is ultimately a political challenge, and to weather it and to defeat it, we need a really broad, really engaged, really united political coalition that can come together in support of democracy. And so that will require a lot of commitments from folks across the ideological spectrum, making smart strategic choices, being thoughtful about communications, and picking battles that can unite and engage and mobilize that broad pro-democracy coalition over time. So anyways, really looking forward to hearing what others have to say and questions. And again, thank you so much for putting this on.
Thanks, Justin. Rachael, your work has focused in particular on the overall environment surrounding elections, which, our next one is 20 days away. What's your assessment of that environment today, and what concerns you?
Yeah, thanks so much, Peter. Excited to be here. And that was a great lead in, because that is what I want to talk about. Both of Bart and Justin before me, talked about what could happen. I want to talk about the environment in which that could happen. And so at ASD, the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund, it is a mouthful, but we look at autocratic threats to democracy. That's usually we start with Russia, China, Iran, and what are their tools and tactics, and how are they attempting to interfere. But very quickly, that gets you from foreign to domestic actors, and the tools and tactics aren't that different, and the environment is the same environment. So we are looking mostly at the information space, but taking that toolkit into account. But I'll focus here on the information space, which is more opaque and fragmented and complex than any time in history. We have less access to the big social media platforms as researchers than we've ever had before. So less insight into what exactly is going on in certain corners of the information space. And there are more platforms than ever before. They're self-selecting. So we have robust information silos and echo chambers. So this is so add on to that generative AI and the ability to make realistic fake images, audio, and video on the cheap with easy access, and it supercharges that environment. We haven't seen that deployed at scale. I'm sure all of you have seen some coverage of different AI deepfakes or the AI threat, but it's a new tool, and foreign actors especially are experimenting with it. And so we've seen where we're most concerned is like that intersection between the information manipulation piece and the election administration piece. And obviously in 2020, there was we had a president at the time that didn't want to give up power and refused to acknowledge to this day that he won, or that his opponent won the election. And we're seeing groundwork being laid now, rhetorically speaking, for Trump to potentially do something similar this year. So you can see false narratives that are being spread in this information space. One controversy that we're looking at, and one narrative where we're tracking closely, is non-citizen voting, laying the foundation that there was some kind of massive voter fraud that took place as a way to muddy whatever outcome comes. So that is definitely something in the bag. I think if you look, just to zoom in on the domestic information space, if you look at the North Carolina, the response to Hurricane Helene, and how quickly a natural disaster was weaponized, both by domestic and then, a little bit behind foreign actors echoing, but mostly domestic actors to sow confusion, to score political points. And this is a situation where lives are actually on the line. Whereas in previous campaigns, I don't need to tell anyone here about norms that might have been blown out of the water, but previous campaigns, there was some kind of guardrails when in like a disaster response scenario. So what is the impact here? The impact is trust. It's an impact on trust and a lack of it. So Axios recently did a survey that I will read to you because I've been talking about it since it published maybe last week. But in it, they found that 54% of respondents agree with this statement. I've disengaged from politics because I can't tell what's true. There are two alarming elements to that finding. First, that you can't distinguish good information from bad. And second, that the solution is disengagement. So that is something when we're talking about solutions, the idea that our politics is so, one, hard to understand because we're not working off a shared truth. And two, so unpleasant to participate in, that people's reaction is disengagement. That is going to leave the door open to authoritarianism or bad actors or just simply bad policy if we don't find a way to re-engage. So I will say, I'll leave you with a few what we can do because we should get to some questions. But one is engaged in politics. I will another very telling poll that Gallup did. It asked voters, how do you identify? What's your party identification? And the split was about 25% Republican, 25% Democrat, and 50% independent. 50% of America they're not independents. They simply don't want to be affiliated with the two parties, and that is a huge problem, and one that we're going to have to figure out in the years to come from a political reform angle, participation, something along those lines. And then I would say engage on the community level. Justin had a ton of great ideas for engagement from your professional capacity. I think we all have to take responsibility for how we engage in our own communities because I've talked to folks all over the country, and I'm totally convinced now that the only way we really get at this problem is community up. And so every individual is going to have to take that seriously. And then finally, check your information diet. When you open your phone, there is someone who's trying to get something from you. And it's the way you think, it's a scam, it's something else. But we just mindlessly, I do this, we just mindlessly go through our phones, and you have to engage with your phone like there's information warfare happening, because there is. All right. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Wow.
Go ahead. Were you about to say something? I'm sorry.
That was just a wow for me.
Wow. Well,
information warfare on your phone. That's a fantastic concept.
Well, let me then put a question to you, Bart. I mean, Rachael is talking about what information people get and how they process it. In some ways, it's not a story that somebody who wants to be president has authoritarian tendencies. Maybe the story is more that half the country roughly seems supportive. And so I guess, I'd be interested in your perspective on why that is. And is it because to some extent people don't accept that narrative of what is going on? Or is it that they accept it and like it? And I direct this to you in part because you wrote what I thought was a riveting article in 2021 that made a big impression on me at the time, and that I've since reread and found really prescient, the one in Atlantic on how Donald Trump could subvert the 2024 election. And you talked a lot to people who looked at people who were at the Capitol on January 6th and people who later came to support them. And it's 3 years later, but I just wonder what your perspective is on what the currents are in the country that make all this possible.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, which plays off of Rachel's point about not knowing where to find good information or whether there even is any good information, is that Atlantic cover story you're referring to created in me something that I could dignify with the name of a kind of epistemological crisis, but really boiled down to losing my faith in the profession that I had spent my whole career in. Washington Post, Time Magazine, The Atlantic. I've been a journalist and a nonfiction author for almost all my adult life, And I had always imagined that I was writing for my ideal reader was someone who was interested and open to evidence, was prepared to be told, here's what I'm observing, and this is how I think I know that, with receipts. And I just started thinking, writing for the Atlantic, I'm not reaching, if I'm reaching one Trump voter, I'd be surprised. I interviewed for that article a fire captain, a retired captain of the NY, New York Fire Department, who believed in all the Trump election denial conspiracy theories. And I decided to try an experiment in which I would go back and talk to him over and over and over again. He was willing. And I spent many, many hours with him over time, in which he would tell me something like, there were more votes cast than registered voters in the 2020 election. And I would chase that down and say, okay, I'll tell you where that comes from. It actually comes from a tweet that mixes apples and oranges. Here's the one data source, here's the other data source. So it turns out there were not more votes cast than voters registered. So now what do you think? And it didn't even register on him. He just moved on to the next one. He told me that it was really Antifa working with U.S. special forces that had stormed the Capitol and in a false flag operation and had stolen Nancy Pelosi's laptop. And I said, big if true, how do you know that? And he said he got it from a Rumble video in which the speaker was a retired Air Force general. So I watched the video and I tracked down the general and I asked him how he knew that. And he said he had a source he couldn't name who had been on the scene and saw a bunch of very fit young men with short hair who looked like special forces. And one of them had a rectangular bulge under his coat. And from this, he surmised that they were doing this sort of false flag. And that the bulge was Nancy Pelosi's laptop. And, more stuff like that. It was preposterously inadequate as evidence to any thinking person. And then I got a call after talking to the general from the general's son, who said to me, I really wish you wouldn't quote him. We've been trying to get him to stop talking in public because he has early stages of dementia. And I told all that and went through it all step by step with my fire captain. And he was entirely unmoved. He said that he would believe a patriotic general like this guy over the liars at the FBI and the Justice Department. So it was a tribal statement of faith. And he had no use for evidence. He had no use for empirical observations. He would take talking points from his favorite tribal sources and latch onto them. And that was that. There was nothing that could move him. And I started to wonder, what's the point of the kind of journalism I do if I can't find readers who can be moved? So what's going on out there in the public? There is a tribal thing. There is a phenomenon that I read recently about and found fascinating, in which you have a law. It kind of goes back to the early observation from 2016, in which someone, I forget who, so I can't credit her, said you should you should take Trump seriously, but not literally. A lot of his supporters don't actually support fascist behavior. They don't even support, as fun as it sounds to them, prosecuting his political enemies and so forth. And they just don't really believe he's going to do those things. They like that he talks that way. Uh, Paradoxically, his lack of filters makes people think of him as honest, as opposed to the normal politician who's always parsing his or her words and trying to avoid offending anyone. Trump's willingness to give offense uh, makes him feel authentic and truthful to a lot of his supporters. And just in terms of social psychology, there is a substantial fraction of any population, and I don't remember the numbers. There's research that shows there's this substantial fraction that likes a strongman, likes the idea of someone who gets things done and doesn't allow decisions to be picked away by a bunch of compromisers, uh, uh, is strong and manly and decisive, and doesn't let anybody stand in his way. There's a substantial fraction of the population that likes that and values that, and we just have to accept it as part of our democratic electorate and cope with it.
We have a lot of good questions in the chat. Let me just pick out one, Justin, that picks up on something you said. And Sarah Schacht says, anticipatory disobedience is a useful term. In the last several years, we've seen major philanthropies turn away from funding civil society work in democracy, open government, transparency, and training public servants on these concepts. Are funders already demonstrating anticipatory obedience? And let me just add that, is Congress demonstrating already anticipatory obedience? Are other institutions, public and private, businesses, others demonstrating anticipatory obedience? How much is that problem already with us rather than something that we're anticipating?
So I think you see slivers of it in every sector, each that you mentioned. My colleagues, Ian Basson and Max Potter, had a great essay in the Columbia Journalism Review this week about places in the media where we're starting to see it with media companies. In the Congress side, I've been following a little bit the Senate Republican leadership race and the relationship of the candidates in that race to Trump. And you see some of it there where those who once would be more ready to challenge him are more inclined to get in line. On the funder side, you certainly see funders who are being targeted by authoritarian aligned folks who are trying to shape funder behavior and push them out. My own perception, and I'm curious what others think, is that they have been largely doing great work and providing funding for a broad range of organizations and doing really thoughtful planning towards 2025 that looks in particular at how they can help their grantees in this situation. So how they can make sure that their grantees know that there are resources available if they're targeted, and set up kind of some of those NATO Article 5 type defense networks so that there's legal support or communication support or security support if grantees are targeted in ways that allow all those civil society organizations to continue to do the work of democracy. So to me, the jury is very still out on this. Like, there are some warning signs, but in my view, we are holding for now.
Rachael, you talked about the problem of disengagement. I wonder if you could address the risks of the wrong types of active engagement. And by that, I simply mean, I saw the other day that the Institute for the Study of Modern Authoritarianism came out with a poll, and a non-trivial number of respondents in some combination approve of January 6th, think that the election of Kamala Harris would be a crisis for democracy, and expect the upcoming election to be the most corrupt in our history. That all sounds like a recipe for potentially great difficulties depending on the outcome of the election in the immediate aftermath and beyond. What do you see as the risk of violence or non-acquiescence in results in the period after Election Day, depending on the outcome? And, what is your work showing you on that?
Yeah, so a few things. I mean, first on those poll results, to me, that reads like people who can't trust information that they're getting, right? And so when you can't trust something, you kind of go to a place of worst case scenario. Um, I can't talk to everyone that was polled, but that is concerning. I was trying to go back and find there was a New York Times poll several months ago, and it asked dug in there was one of their swing state polls, but also in there was a question about if the US government needs significant overhaul. And it was like, don't quote me on this on the record conversation, but it was high. It was like 60-70% of people agreed with that statement, like a robust overhaul. And so I think a lot of this is dissatisfaction with how they view our US democracy playing out in individuals' lives. So I just wanted to get that in there. On the violence front, I mean, we don't look at political violence per se. We look at the environment in which political violence can be more likely. And we were chatting about this a little bit before the panel, but we're at the prediction stage of this election and the events that come out that's like, this extreme scenario could happen, or the exact opposite extreme scenario could happen, or anything in between. So I don't know how useful predictions are at this stage. But there's definitely the potential out there. We have seen an increase, obviously, in threats against our election workers, our election officials, a continued drumbeat undermining confidence in the election administration and outcome. And all of that could be a matchbook kind of situation. And then finally, on the funder question, I just wanted to address we are funded by several core family foundations who've been incredibly supportive of the Alliance for Security and Democracy. But I will say we do work in the information space. It has been a real target, and we do have some peer organizations that have either completely reconstituted, gone away, had to reevaluate how they're doing the work they're doing, or switch work. So that is very much a real thing that peer organizations have been experiencing.
Well, we're just about out of time. I do see one question that is a purely factual question, which I can answer in 30 seconds. And so I will do that. And the question says this is more of a legal/constitutional question. But if Trump wins and nominates an attorney general who will drop the January 6th case and the Senate refuses to confirm that choice, can he install a temporary AG? And the answer under the law, there's a law called the Vacancies Act, is yes, he can't install just anyone as acting AG. They have to be either at a certain level of the civil service, a pretty high level, or they have to be somebody who's already serving in government as a Senate confirmed official. There are Republicans doing that now on some regulatory commissions, and there are certainly a wide range of ideologies among the senior civil servants throughout the government. So yes, there could be an acting AG installed that I think he would find compatible. He just would need to look for that person. And I actually mentioned that even though it's a kind of a stray fact, just because I think it underscores something Bart said about the beginning about just the capaciousness of a president's powers. It is very hard to fully stop a president from doing something a president is determined to do. My takeaway from the exercise that I participated in, that Bart led, which I thought was masterfully conceived, was that, a bad administration can try 10 things, and maybe the opposition stops 7 of them, being very optimistic. And at the end of that, the score is not 7-3. The score is 3-0. Because maybe the status quo has been maintained on those other 7 things and 3 bad things have been done. So I think, it's a very difficult challenge. I am really quite grateful for not only the participation by our 3 guests here today, but by everything they've been doing and are continuing to do in this space going forward. And I thank everybody for joining.
Thank you
So much.